I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share with you today, because one of my own passions and the reason I spent a number of years working in Southern Africa is that I want to see and to develop important theological voices coming from the majority world. I don't want it all to be middle-aged white blokes like me from Australia or America or Britain or Germany. There are so many voices that we need to hear. And so I hope that this session can be an encouraging one and a helpful one. I'm going to share a screen with you, which I hope will come up nice and clear. Publishing your PhD and working with publishers go so closely together that I thought it was really important that I bring them together, because so much of what I say about publishing your PhD, and that will be the primary focus, has immediate implications for how you work with publishers more generally. And so it seems to me most helpful to treat those two subjects together. Now, the PowerPoint I'm keeping as simple as I can so that I don't get myself lost where I'm up to. But there's a couple of questions that I think you need to ask from the outset with your PhD. The first one is, should I publish the PhD? Now, when I'm speaking about should I publish, I think every PhD should produce published material. By that, I mean that the goal of a PhD is to make an original contribution to knowledge. And if we've made a contribution, and especially we're thinking in theology about the gospel, then we don't want a contribution simply to sit on a university's shelves gathering dust in that section of doctoral theses that the occasional researcher will find their way to, but most people never quite go that far down the back stairs to find where all the theses might be. So every work should produce something that is published. I'll get to that a little bit more later on. But not every PhD should be published as a monograph, as a complete work. So the first question you've got to ask yourself is, should I publish? Now, there is no one rule that tells you whether it should be published or not. But here are a couple of guidance points that you might find helpful. First of all, when your thesis is examined, what was the response of your examiners? This is probably the single most important point of all. Now, in Britain, where I work now, in Australia, where I grew up, doctoral theses are all assessed on a pass-fail basis. It doesn't matter how much better it is than what is necessary to be passed, you still only get a pass. So you don't get a PhD with distinction or anything like that. On the other hand, in other parts of the world, I'm thinking of North America, or in fact, South Africa, where I did do my PhD, you receive a grade. And that grade is from the examiners. So they're saying, not only did you pass, but how well did you pass? Now, if I take the British model for a moment, after your examiners have said to you, yes, you are going to receive the PhD, it's always useful to ask them the question, would they support publication? If they do, then you know you have a piece of work that they've not only said, yes, this meets the criteria, but this is a good piece of work. This is a particularly solid PhD, and it should well be published as a thesis. They may suggest to you that there will be some changes necessary, depending on how you present it as a thesis and what might be seen as the need of a book. If you go through one of those ones that gives a grade, again, you should talk to your examiners, but you can look at the grade, and if they've given you a grade that is just a pass, probably the thesis as a monograph is not what you're looking at. If it's better than that, then I think you can reasonably do that. But always have a conversation with your examiners, have a conversation with your supervisor as to whether it might be publishable or not. The other thing that you need to start thinking about is from the perspective of the publisher. So we naturally are doing our thinking from the perspective of, I've done the research, I would like to see it published. From the perspective of a publisher, the question is, am I going to sell enough copies of this book to cover the cost of having produced it in the first place? And as much as we might want publishers simply to publish our books, they need to make enough money off the publication of them to stay in business. That's the nature of the relationship that we have with them. So you need to ask, is the topic sufficiently broad that a publisher might find publication viable? Now, really important to say, what is broad for the publication of a PhD thesis is not the same as, is it going to sell as well as the Harry Potter novels? Obviously, if your PhD thesis sells as well as the Harry Potter novels, everybody is going to be very, very happy. Not any PhD thesis that I know have ever done that. There may be one somewhere, but it doesn't tend to happen. PhD publishers are usually happen if they can sell between 300 and 500 copies worldwide of your piece of work. So is there, at least within the discipline that you're working on, enough other people who are working in this area, or who, made aware of your work, might realize they need to work in this area, that a publisher could find the publication viable? So that's your other question. On the one side, does the discipline of which I'm a part recognize this as a work that should be published? On the other side, is it likely to be received by a publisher positively? So what did your examiners say? Always explore that. Sometimes, even for a really good PhD, however, it might be better to publish your work in the form of journal essays rather than a monograph. Now, the reasons for that might be that you've got 2 or 3 quite distinct areas within the thesis. So the number of readers who are going to read the whole of the thesis and find it helpful might be very, very small. So if you, for example, had, I don't know anyone who's done this, but you're doing something on fictional autobiography in Acadian literature in dialogue with contemporary North American evangelical Christian fiction, for example, the number of people with the technical skills to read both areas of that is very, very small. On the other hand, you might find that a journal that focuses more on Acadian studies might take one part of it as a couple of essays. A journal of practical theology might take the other couple of essays. So it's going to be also in the nature of the piece of work. Does it only sit within one discipline, in which case it makes it much easier for a publisher to see how it works? Or is it crossing several disciplines, which are sufficiently diverse that it might be better to look at a series of journal essays so that the particular area of your contribution within each of those segments receives its best outcome? Throughout all of this, I hope you would be able to continue speaking with your supervisor because they're going to be your best friend in seeking to understand that. From here on in, I'm going to assume that we are talking about publishing of a monograph. And of course, bear in mind that every PhD should be of publishable quality. That is, the overall work should be of publishable quality. So for most of you, it should be able to move towards a monograph, but just with those caveats. Second question, and this is the one I'm often asked by my students: which publisher? To which the answer is, well, that rather depends. But you need to begin by putting together a list of possible publishers that you could work with. Again, talk to your supervisor, talk to your examiners for suggestions. Who is it that is publishing PhD theses in this particular area? And be aware that the number of publishers who are publishing PhD theses is changing fairly frequently all the time. So they should be more aware of who is doing that work. But you might start thinking to yourself, well, who would I like to publish with? And there are certain clues that you can begin to go with. So for example, who are the publishers who are issuing work that is similar to yours? Now, one simple way that you can do this is look at your own bibliography and just see, are there publishers or published PhD theses in your own bibliography? Because it's very likely that those publishers are the people who might be interested in a work that is similar to yours. So that's often a very useful technique, but it won't tell you everything. So again, make sure you're talking to your supervisor about who might give you good guidance. I wouldn't generally just do a search on the internet, because you're likely to find any number of rather doubtful publishing houses. So guidance and help here is always helpful, but there will be others out there that you're not necessarily aware of. Now, sometimes you're going to look for publishers who are theologically sympathetic. And this might be because you are looking for work in Christian colleges, churches, missions, and so on. And they may look to say, well, who have you published with? Because that will give them a sense of theologically where you're sitting. On the other hand, sometimes if you're looking to work in a state university, being published in a Christian publishing house might not be the best thing, and you might be better than looking for one of the state publishers, such as we find in the Netherlands or Germany. It's going to vary from person to person, depending upon the type of career path that you feel that God is calling you to, and the type of work that you are trying to publish. And obviously, the more overtly theological it is, the more likely it is that you are going to need to work with a theologically interested publisher. On the other hand, especially a lot of biblical studies where we do a lot of ancient Near Eastern or archaeological work, the sort of theological sympathies of the publisher may not have a great deal of bearing, and it may be better to look somewhere else. But you start compiling this list, and you start whittling it down. Do I need theological sympathy or not? I would suggest that you always look for publishers who use peer review. A peer review process is a mechanism by which the publisher, having received your manuscript, will send that off to 2 or 3 readers who will have an anonymized text. So they'll remove anything that indicates that it's you, certainly from the title page, so that the reviewers don't know who it is or the situation in which you completed the work and it was published. And they're simply reading it from the perspective of, I'm a scholar who works in this area. Is this a piece of work which is making a contribution that is valid, that is secure in terms of its methodology, and this work is of publishable quality? There are publishers who will offer to publish PhDs for you without that. I would say avoid them at all costs. The reason for that is most of them are happy to take money from you, and I'll talk about co-publication fees in a moment. But you don't have any obvious standing as a result of that publication. The people who do peer review are the publishers whose work is respected. And in terms of publishing your PhD, you don't want simply to say, oh, I've got a book out there, that's great. You want it to be published somewhere that people are going to respect it and think, oh, this is in a source that I can trust. If it's in a publisher that doesn't go through that process, a good many university libraries, for example, simply won't take it. And so you've done the work, but it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. So you do want to look for publishers who do peer review. As a PhD publisher, you do need to understand that some publishers will ask for a co-publication fee. This is, I know, very, very disappointing because you'd all love to think that somebody would want to publish your work with no charge. And some will do that, just to be clear. But others will ask for a co-publication fee. The reason for this is that as an author, nobody knows who you are. Your supervisor knows who you are, your family knows who you are, probably the other PhD students on your program know who you are, but the academic world doesn't yet know your name. And therefore, the publisher is taking a risk on you. So some of them will ask for a co-publication fee. Again, if it's all fee, no peer review, and it's going to be done very quickly, these are usually the ones who want to take money from you, and you want to stay as far away from them as you possibly can. But a number of reputable publishers do ask for a co-publication fee. As I say, it's not necessarily a problem. It may be one of the reasons why you choose not to go with a particular publisher, and that would be understandable. But just to understand that that can be a request. Another thing you want to look at when you're asking about which publisher is the marketing support the publisher provides. To put it simply, if you've published, you want people to read it. And if no one knows that it's been published, then the benefit of publishing is really lost. So what marketing support do they do? Now, this is where publishing in an academic series is obviously very, very useful. I'm sure you all know various series that get published by different publishing houses. And some libraries just love to have the whole series laid out, where everything in the same color is there, and there's just a little volume number going along. And the librarian loves to have everything from 1 to 724. This is the Library of the Hebrew Bible I'm thinking about. But other series are available, and they're all lined up and they look so pretty. Those are great. Publishers like them because they know a lot of libraries will subscribe to them. But is there other marketing that they're providing? Are they making sure that the book goes out to review in good places? Are they providing catalogs that go to college libraries, to university libraries, and so on? Are they represented at major conferences where you might be speaking, or where people who are working in your area might be speaking, and will have a chance to see them? So when you're looking at them, it's really important to say, well, what support do they provide? Now, there may, of course, be a shortcut to all of this, which is that you might have a link with a publisher already through your institution or through your sponsorship. So some institutions actually have a publisher they work with, or some of the universities in Sweden, for example, all their theses, historically at least, were published with a particular state publisher. If you're a Langham scholar, then you may be able to access through the Langham publication system. So some of you may be able to have shortcuts to that. If you've got that, blessed are you, take full advantage of it, and that can make things much, much easier for you to get your work out there, because they will do a good job for you. But those are some of the questions that you might want to look at. Now, once you've got to the stage of saying which publisher, you then have to go into the process of writing a proposal. And writing a proposal, really, for a PhD or for another book you want to publish, the process from here on is exactly the same. So you've identified a publisher. Right. Look at their policies, look at their procedures. Now, all the reputable publishers, and unfortunately a lot of the disreputable ones too, do have websites. On those websites, you should be able to find their statements about their policies, their procedures. So what are they looking for? When you've submitted, what will they do for you? What are their procedures going to be once they receive your manuscript? Roughly how long should you expect to wait for response, feedback, and so on? You want to look at those, because before you write the proposal, it's really helpful to say, is this a publisher that I'm looking to work with? Assuming that you've looked at that, what are their stated goals for their work? And you want to look and say, well, how does my proposal align with that? Now, with a number of publishers, you will find they actually have several series that will publish PhD theses, and you might look and think, well, there's 2 or 3 of them that could fit my work. So you're going to have to go not only to the publisher in general and its goals, but also to the particular series in which they are publishing it, and how that works. And what you need to do when you're writing a proposal is make sure that you demonstrate how the work that you are proposing lines up with their stated goals. What is it about your thesis or your book proposal, if it's beyond your thesis, that matches their goals? How is what you're doing going to extend their work as a publisher? Now, buried further down, there's invariably a whole host of documents that they will ask you to submit. And so you need to make sure that you do that in the correct order. So they may, for example, say, do not send the whole thesis until we have received a proposal, and then we will decide whether we want to receive the thesis. Others will want you to send the thesis straight away. Some will want supporting statements from your examiners. Some will say, we will contact the examiners later on, and so on. There is no one process that every publisher follows. This can be very frustrating, but nonetheless, that's the way that you need to work. So look at their goals, look at the goals of the particular series where there is a particular series, make sure that's there, make sure the documents are there. And that does mean that if you move from one publisher to another, and this you will probably find deeply frustrating, you will need to draft a completely separate proposal every time. Don't simply try and rewrite in a sort of very general and quick way a proposal that you had submitted to somebody else, because their goals are not the same. So what I tell my own students to do is, by all means, have that document open on your computer, but start with a blank document, looking at what it is that these publishers are looking for, and write to it. You can often go back and check and say, I'm sure I had something on that. If you've got something on that, at that point, by all means, pull it across. But as much as possible, write afresh to what it is that they're looking for. And in general, I would want to say it's best to have only one proposal in review at a time. So it's quite reasonable to, if they just say, give us a short proposal document, to write to several publishers. But once you get to the point of saying, I'm going to have a manuscript with them, you really need to work with one publisher at a time. The reason for that is that the publishers will begin a process. That process is going to cost them money of appointing reviewers. It's going to take time within their own publication office as they're looking at your work, making a decision about it. They do not want to discover that you've gone to another publisher at the same time, and at the point where they finish everything, and come back and say, yes, we'd like to take your work, for you to then say, oh, actually, I've gone to somebody else. Reason that's bad is that publishers do talk to one another. And in the same way as Old Testament scholars keep running into each other at various meetings, and the same is true, I'm pretty sure, for all the other disciplines, the publishers meet up as well. And it doesn't take terribly long for them to say, you don't want to work with this person because. So building a really good relationship with publishers matters. And if your publication of your PhD goes well with a publisher, then they're going to be much more open to you coming to them with another proposal later on. So it's building relationship that matters. So once you get to the stage of a manuscript is up for review, then stay with them. You are going to have to wait several months as it goes through, but nonetheless, that's really, I think, important things to do. So just thinking about the review process. So we've gone through the process, we've identified a publisher, we've identified perhaps a series within that, we've had a proposal put in, and the manuscript has now gone to them. This is going to be the point where you start to feel incredibly frustrated even more. Beware of this. The reason is that every publisher has different guidance on style from every other one. If you don't yet know what an M dash is as opposed to an N dash, as opposed to an ordinary dash, almost certainly you are going to discover that in the preparation of a manuscript. They will have a guidance on style about how you lay out headings, how you reference works, how you do your footnotes, down to things like the publication details of the name of the publisher and the location of the publisher in parentheses, or they're not, there's a full stop. Or you put the editor of an edited book at this point before the title, or no, you put it after the title. And all of those things will vary from publisher to publisher. You, of course, have written your thesis in line with your institution's guidance on style. And after a while, that just starts to feel to you absolutely normal about that's what the style is, that's how you do it. But it turns out that they all have something different. Now, if your institution uses the SBL Handbook of Style, at least in biblical studies, you've got a good chance that that will either match or be a very close match to a good many publishers, but it's not the only one. So sometimes you've used footnotes, but they now want in-text referencing, Harvard style. You're going to have to make all of those changes and submit your manuscript in their style. That does take time. Except also that publishers who send your manuscript to reviewers will produce a report, and you are likely to wait 3 or 4 months before that happens. Reason is, once they receive the manuscript, they then contact potential reviewers. They have to identify the potential reviewers. The potential reviewers then have to receive the manuscript. These days it's electronic, so it can be a little bit quicker than it used to be when everyone had to get a hard copy. And then they have to read it. They have to prepare a report. If, for example, a manuscript comes into a Northern Hemisphere scholar at this time of year when we're trying to finish off our academic year, it's really difficult to find the time. So you do have to accept that it typically takes 3 to 4 months for that review, and there's not a lot you can do for that. A manuscript is only accepted for publication after review, and it's probably at this point that they're likely to issue with contract, and so on. Now, the review process will often throw up suggestions for change, and then you will need to negotiate with the publisher whether or not those changes happen. Sometimes you might say, well, the changes are too substantial, it will change the fundamental argument, and you may need to go to a different publisher and start the process again. A lot of the time, they're simply trying to say, this will make for a more readable piece of work, and you may need to make those changes. Presuming you agree with the changes, you then have to produce a revised manuscript, and there will be an agreed time by which they ask you to do that. So you will find that you have periods of inactivity, and then all of a sudden a really busy time where a great many things suddenly have to be done in a fairly short time period. So just to be aware of that. Once you get the manuscript in, you may think this is the end of the process. I think the first time I submitted a full book manuscript, I thought, fantastic, it's finished. Now all I'm going to do is sit back and wait for the book to be published. I could not have been more wrong had I tried. This is not the end of the process, because what will happen next will depend on the publisher. Some publishers, as a way, for example, of avoiding a co-publication fee, will say, you have to do the typesetting on your work. Now, typesetting these days is done entirely electronically. Usually they will say, here is a way of setting it out in Word or another word processor, and you have to lay it out in a very particular way, and they will tell you how to do it. And you will discover that Microsoft Word has a whole range of features that it would never have occurred to you that you would ever need to use, but they're all there really for publishers. Or you might work with a text editor from there who will come back with a whole host of questions and sentences that you thought was so clear. They'll come back to you and say, I don't know what this sentence means. Are you saying? And you'll discover that some of the times you didn't write as well as you were sure that you had. But be aware of that. The publisher will then prepare proofs for you to check before publication. Now, good publishers will usually give you warning that the proofs are coming. And the reason they will do that is that once we get to the stage of proofs, we are close to the point of the book appearing. You will want to check your proofs very, very carefully. So a friend of mine once said, the only thing quicker than the speed of light is the time it takes to open your new book and see the first typo. So take time to read what you've got carefully, to check all the things that they're asking for. You'd like to think that when you've produced a document and they've largely had to cut and paste that document, that everything would come across correctly, but you'd be surprised how often moving between different platforms creates small errors at various points, especially for someone like myself, who has a lot of Hebrew and other ancient Near Eastern languages. This can go wrong fairly quickly as well. So just to be aware of that. So check the proofs. It's also quite likely, especially for a thesis, that you're going to be asked to produce indexes for the book. And the indexes are produced off the back of the proofs. Now, you can pay sometime to have somebody prepare the index, but a lot of the time for a PhD especially, the expectation is that you are going to be the one who does that. Now, again, because you get that electronically, that's nowhere near as difficult as it once was. but I will tell you that it is mind-numbingly dull. But it needs to be done. And the reason it needs to be done, of course, is that we want people who are not going to necessarily read the whole of the book to be able to find important parts for work that they are doing. So indexes are a really important resource in the preparation of the book. So when you know indexes are coming, when you know proofs are coming, you need to make sure you clear as much time as you can. Around about this time, you're also likely to hear from the publisher's marketing department. And this means you will have somebody new from the publisher that you hadn't known existed before, and they will want information from you. So, for example, potential endorsements. So, you know, on the back cover of a book, there's often nice quotes from scholars that are well known. And what usually happens is they will send those proofs to those people and ask them to write those nice comments. They will ask about journals where the thesis or the monograph should be placed for review. Now, if it's in a series, they'll usually have a list of journals that they normally work with, but they will always ask you because there may be specific ones that will be relevant for your work that go beyond that. They want to do that. They also want to know who it is that might be reading this thesis. Now, to some extent, you should have told them that in the proposal, but the marketing department doesn't really want to read all the detail that was in the proposal. So they want you to say, who's going to read this, so that they can look closely at how it is they're going to market the book. And all of this means that it's not uncommon for a period between 8 to 12 months to happen between the acceptance of the manuscript and the publication of the book. During COVID, I had one that took a good deal longer than that because no one was able to progress things, but I think we're moving back to the normal things. So just be aware that in that year after your manuscript has been accepted, there is a lot of work that's going to come in short bursts of quite significant activity, and you need to be able to clear the time to do that so that the book can be produced on time as is necessary. And at that point, when the book appears, then you sit back and celebrate, or you start thinking about what the next book is going to be.